So last year in the fall, I spent a week in Nairobi. And I got there and took a car into a place called Mathare, which is a slum in the city. And the cab driver at first wouldn't go to Mathare because he'd heard it was really dangerous and he'd never been there himself. And I convinced him finally that this was an okay place to go. And so we go, and I'm on the phone with this guy I've never met before, trying to navigate to his home. And we passed all manner of crazy things, open sewers. I actually went to the public toilet in Mathare, which was quite an experience, and I was told was much better than any of the other toilets in Mathare. We passed all sorts of informal jobs, people working in quarries, people doing manual labor, children walking around and selling things. And then we finally get to Ken's house, which is a tiny little room in a row of houses that are made of mud with a tin roof. And Ken welcomes me. He sits me down. He's got an old copy of Moby Dick and 2 other novels. And he lives in a one-room little hovel, essentially, in this slum with his wife and his adorable daughter, who I met shortly after. And all of his possessions are in this tiny little room. And Ken started telling me his life story. He grew up in Mathare. He was orphaned when he was about 10. His mother died of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, along with 7 of her 9 siblings. And Ken wanted desperately to get out of the slum. He told me that his major life goal and a commitment that he made to himself when his mother died was to leave the slum so that his daughter didn't suffer the same fate. So rewinding a little bit, after Ken became an orphan, he managed to succeed in school. He got a scholarship to one of Nairobi's best boarding schools, where he was almost kicked out because he was caught stealing toothpaste and toilet paper from other students. He was too embarrassed to ask them to borrow, and he literally had not enough money to buy the essentials. And a dean was very fond of Ken, so he managed to graduate from that high school. And then he was stuck with no job and no prospect of going to college because there isn't a really thriving student loan market in Kenya. So he went back to Mathare. And he actually took me to the Mathare River, which is a euphemism for this like cesspool of sewage that flows through Mathare. And on the banks of Mathare River, there are these guys who brew a type of local moonshine called changa, which is mixed with kerosene and sold locally and is highly addictive and is one of the reasons that a lot of people succumb to diseases like multi-drug resistant TB because their immune systems are so compromised by drinking these toxic substances. So Ken, for about a year, made a living selling this horrible toxic brew, changa, to fellow residents, and he did it because he had no other choice. Now, Ken speaks beautiful English. He reads novels like Moby Dick when he can get his hands on them. So how is it that a guy like Ken ended up living in Mathare? It just doesn't add up. It turns out that Ken is one of a number of young people who graduate from high schools in the developing world and who have the talent and the will to get a job, but there aren't any jobs available to them. And most of us tend to regard people like Ken as charity cases. When we see pictures of people living in slums, we don't really think of them as an able talent pool. We think of them as people who are deserving of our charity, of our pity, and our help. But certainly they don't seem like equals in the global economic system. And yet, upon further probing, one discovers pretty quickly that Ken is extremely talented and that surviving in a place like Mathare takes quite a lot of resilience. So it begged a lot of questions for me. You know, what is someone like Ken doing in this slum? And Ken ended up finding a job with Sama a couple of years after he finished his changa brewing experience through a local partner. So in 2008, I founded an organization called Sama Source. We're now called Sama. Sama means equal in Sanskrit. And the mission was to connect people like Ken to work through the internet. And I had this idea. I kept meeting people in developing countries through different types of work I'd done for NGOs and through studying international development. And all of the programs that I was participating in as a volunteer or as an aid worker seemed to be providing a service or a good to low-income people, but rarely was I providing a job. And yet what people on the ground, people like Ken, would tell me all the time was, I just want a job. Give us work. Hire me as your translator or your driver or as your assistant. Because a job with income would be far more valuable to me than whatever you're providing as a service to us. So that stuck in my brain. I ended up developing this NGO called Samasource, and 5.5 years after founding Samasource, Ken wanders into one of our centers. We have a partnership with a youth organization in Mathare that trains young people in computer skills. And that organization referred him to us, and Ken got a job doing data entry. And fast forward a year later, Ken just got hired by our team because he's been one of the best workers that we've ever had. He chose to stay in the slum a little bit longer because he owns his home there, but he's saving up money to leave. His daughter is now going to a really great school. It's a private school that's going to give her a world-class education, Ken says. And his circumstances have dramatically changed. His income went from about $800 a year on a good year to about $3,300 a year, which is a significant income gain and puts him over the poverty line locally, enables him to pay for healthcare and education expenses for relatives who live far from Mathare, as well as for his wife and daughter. So pretty dramatic difference. And one of the craziest things about what Ken does for people who are used to hearing about job creation schemes in the international development sector, we might think, well, maybe Ken is doing some kind of microfinance project. Maybe he got a loan to fund his local fruit stall and he's selling more fruits now. Well, Ken is doing something really different from all that. Ken is actually, prior to getting hired by Sama, Ken was making a living tagging photos for Getty Images of celebrities, which is pretty crazy thinking about it. People tagging pictures of Kim Kardashian and Andy Murray in the middle of a slum. Getty Images is one of our largest clients at Samasource, and we came up with a model of unitizing work. We call it micro work, and sending those small units of work to people who are competent, generally who've finished high school. They can read and write English, but they don't have very advanced skills yet. So many of them have just learned how to use a computer. Many of them are new to a formal office-like work environment. People like Ken. So once they start working with us, they do basic tasks like image tagging, and then they can quickly move up the value chain to higher level tasks. Things like writing a response to a customer inquiry on a customer service platform. Things like writing a caption for a video to label it for some kind of video archive. Even higher skilled content writing for different websites. So it's a really interesting new kind of career path in the digital economy that people for the first time are able to access from places like Mathare. And this has really revolutionized Ken's life. Ken is now one of about 6,300 workers who's gone through our program. And initially when I founded Samasource, my main goal was to found a poverty alleviation organization that could actually measure how many people we moved over the poverty line each year, and by how much and at what cost to donors. So we started tracking this data really early on, and one of my big questions was, once someone joins Samasource, someone like Ken, and they work for us for 6 or 9 months, what happens when they leave? Are they going to go back to living at $800 or less per year? How do I know that we're making an impact that goes beyond just the wages that we're paying them in the short term? So we started tracking that. And earlier this year, we completed our first 3-year income study to find out what happens to people like Ken. And we found that about 89% of them stay at or above the line that they leave Samasource at. So it's about $3,300. And most of them get poached to do better paying jobs, which is really surprising because these are people who were unemployed before and had a really tough time entering the formal job market. They couldn't, say, walk into a bank and hand them a CV and get a job as a bank teller. They couldn't walk into any kind of office environment and get a job. So how is it that these people were able to advance? Well, we found that just the experience of working in a formal office environment, writing a CV for the very first time, and having exposure to the international economy was quite something for young people. And that people as motivated as Ken would learn quite quickly how to function in a formal work environment. So that's what we've seen. We've seen that this model has had a pretty dramatic impact on each individual who goes through our program. The majority of them are women. About 54% of our workforce is women, and most of them between the ages of 19 and 27. The average age is probably about 23. And we've seen a pretty interesting impact beyond the income that these people generate. And we see things like an increase in the health and education expenditures at the household level. We've seen a researcher from LSE studied some of our workers in India. We have an all-women's center in a Muslim neighborhood outside of Calcutta in India. And we saw something really surprising. We saw that women for the first time were voting after they were at Samasource for about 3 months. And we did not anticipate this. We have no political agenda. We don't teach people to vote or get involved in civic activities. But what some of the women told us was that when they started earning money, they started realizing that they were paying tax. And when they started paying tax, they realized that they were contributing to all the infrastructure that they saw around them, and they had a right to influence how that infrastructure unfolded. And this brought up a really interesting point that's been researched more recently in international aid circles, which is the idea of the social contract that is formed when a government gets its primary revenue from the tax base. What happens in a lot of developing economies is that a large stream of income enters the economy in the form of aid, which creates a relationship between the government of that country and not the people of that country, but the donor country, right? And it creates a really strange set of incentives for the government to perform for donors, but not necessarily for the people to whom it's ultimately accountable. And creating wealth through the mechanism of the market ultimately, I believe, drives the best outcomes for citizens in country. Because once those people start paying taxes and government starts raising money from that tax base, all of a sudden there are these accountabilities to people on the ground that never existed before, to people that were previously invisible in the international aid model. And that's what the experience in India taught us. That even women from an extremely conservative Muslim neighborhood outside Calcutta who keep hijab outside the home, who were previous to Samasource not allowed to work outside the home because their parents thought it would be too dangerous, who had very little say within the household, let alone outside in the community, that when they started earning money and they started engaging with social systems, they, for the first time, started seeing their own power. And not just in terms of the government, but they also started seeing their own power at home. We had reports of the local imam in that community coming into our center and asking when there would be more of these centers because the families of the women we were employing were so excited about the additional income. So we saw all of these unintended benefits of this business model. And we also encountered a lot of challenges. Many people in the international aid sector have criticized Samasource. We have been told that, before we launched in the US, that we were ruining America because we were stealing American jobs and giving them to people in refugee camps and rural parts of India. We heard that we were creating a new underclass of digital slaves, akin to sweatshop workers who are mindlessly processing images. We heard that we were helping these big corporations that are our clients, companies like Google and Microsoft, just get richer off the backs of the poor. We heard a number of critiques. But I think that what we're doing represents a new trend, which is the concept of deeper business, of using business models that have for so long been kept only in the private sector and expanding them to address major social challenges, which some people call social entrepreneurship or social business. I think we can even widen that to think about deeper business that exists across a spectrum of purely nonprofit activities and more traditional for-profit activities. In the UK, you have a designation for civic-minded businesses. I forget the name of that designation now, but we have something now in the States which is similar, which is the B Corporation movement, which is this idea that you can form a corporation that maximizes return both from a social and environmental perspective as well as a financial return, which is relatively new for the US. We have not had that as a distinction, as a way to file your business until relatively recently. And I think B corporations are now, you can now register your company as a B corporation in over 10 states, including my home state of California. So we're starting to see a lot of different ways of thinking about social impact and thinking about how business can be a lever for social impact, which is where I think there are the most number of opportunities. I'm a little bit scattered, so I'll just go to one other topic that I really wanted to talk about before we open it up for questions. And that's the broader concept of impact sourcing. Impact sourcing isn't that revolutionary a concept. It's a term that first was used to describe our business model by the Rockefeller Foundation, one of our funders. And it's the idea of using your existing sourcing practices or modifying your existing sourcing practices to create social impact. So in plain English, that means hiring marginalized people, giving them money, and having that process be a main driver of social impact. And if you think about it, this idea has a long history in movements like fair trade, which was probably the first global scaled up movement to think about impact sourcing. One of the tenets of fair trade is to hire people in low-income areas deliberately as a way to promote economic growth in those regions. And fair trade has since been applied to a number of consumer goods, from coffee to, I just co-founded a new enterprise with a woman who started the world's first fair trade underwear company. So even your underwear can be ethical. And now it's extended to all kinds of commodities. But the challenge with impact sourcing through the fair trade model traditionally has been that the gains that are created for people at the bottom of the supply chain, the smallholder farmers who are part of cooperatives that sell coffee or cotton or some other commodity into global markets, still make relatively little, right? Even if they increase their incomes by 25%, we're still talking about people who make very little money. So the gains to the people at the very bottom in a lot of these models where the people at the very bottom are not directly vertically integrated into the retail product, these models don't always result in a major return for marginalized people. And so I think with impact sourcing in the technology era, we have a new ability to connect people much more directly to the gains that are possible in the global economy, because you need far fewer middlemen to sell digital services than you need to sell coffee, right? We can essentially aggregate the supply of digital services in a place like Kenya with one intermediary, which is Sama, and sell those services directly to a company like Google. And what we're seeing is that many of our workers end up leaving Sama to pursue opportunities directly with an international client on a freelancer website like Odesk or Elance. These are sites that are sort of like eBay for services. They just got rebranded as a site called Upwork, which paid out over $1 billion to contractors in the last 2 years. And this is an amazing new movement where you can sign up to directly perform services for a small or medium-sized enterprise abroad. So people can get a job doing data entry or virtual assistance or any number of tasks for a company overseas. And what this means is that all of the intermediaries that were traditionally existing between a wealthy person in the West and a poor person in a developing country are gone, right? And the only sort of tax you pay for participating in that system is any transaction fees on the money and a 10% margin that goes to the platform provider. So that's a radically different way of distributing wealth from the older model of fair trade. And I think the future of impact sourcing is in these much more integrated exchanges where people at the bottom of the economic pyramid can engage much more directly with people at the top, which tends to really benefit those at the bottom. So we now have two major enterprises within Sama. We have Sama Source and a new program called Sama School that has expanded across the US. And Sama School is our training model that teaches people how to make the most of the digital economy. So we teach low-income people generally from community colleges, which is sort of the first layer of more basic tertiary education institutions in the US. They were designed to provide vocational training. And we teach people who are in community colleges and can't really afford to graduate because they're living at the poverty line how to make money on all of these new freelancer websites. And on average, people increase their income by about 10% after doing a 10-week boot camp. And we teach them things like how to set up a LinkedIn profile and what keywords to use, how to set up a profile on a website like Thumbtack or TaskRabbit, or if you have access to a car, a site like Uber or Lyft, which can provide quite a lot of income potential for someone who's living at our poverty line in the US, which is $11,000 a year for a single person and $24,000 a year for a family of 4. So that's the second enterprise. And we are launching a third, which is called Lakshmi, which is an instantiation of what I just mentioned, of impact sourcing in a new category. Lakshmi will aggregate raw materials from small women-led cooperatives in sub-Saharan Africa and market them as high-end beauty products in the US, starting with a skincare line that we hope will be retailing in mid-September. And the idea is, again, to use this same model of impact sourcing to reduce poverty, but in a higher margin category where we can direct some of the margin that we're getting in the luxury space back into our model with Sama and hopefully be less reliant on donors. So that's what we call deeper business. I'm really passionate about extending the impact sourcing model to new categories. And I think that this is really the future of aid, at least for the people in the global economy who have the skill and the will to work. And there are hundreds of millions of people who fit that category who don't have work right now. I think that impact sourcing can be a really interesting way to absorb their skill set and create some short-term benefit for those people. Longer term, as technology begins to take over and we need fewer and fewer people to produce the global economic output that we need to sustain humanity, that's another story. There's probably another set of solutions at that point. But I think for at least the next decade, models like Sama and like Lakshmi and like some of the fair trade type models I've discussed have inordinate potential to create real benefit on the ground for people in need. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. Phil?
Thank you. So of all of the criticisms that you've gotten, and you said you had many, which sound kind of true, like which resonate with you and kind of stick and you're trying to, you wish you could improve on?
Good question.
Thank you.
So first I'll talk a little bit about the ones that I think aren't true to pave the way for the one that I think is true. So first of all, the idea that we have more of a moral duty to people who happen to live in our own country is completely ludicrous to me. Like, I don't think there's much moral salience to nationality. A human being is a human being wherever he or she happens to live, right? My parents were born in India, and our neighbors shouldn't use that against them and say, well, because they weren't born in America, I shouldn't help them if they're in need. So the whole idea that I owe more to someone who's a fellow American than I do to someone in Kenya is ridiculous to me, and that argument never made much sense because I think that's looking at the world as a zero-sum game, right? And it doesn't really operate that way. Turns out that the more trade we do with other countries, generally, the better off people are in the long run. So that's to dispel that one issue. The second concern that people have with our model is that we're teaching people to be drones, right? We're not really giving them higher level skills, and we're teaching them to do what's just a little bit more complicated than what computers do, sitting there tagging images or robotically entering tags for video content, for example. And that is definitely one way of looking at the entry point for Sama. But if we think about, assembly line jobs, which were one of the biggest creators of jobs in the last century, those all started that way too. And once people started earning money, they started being able to invest in higher education and all sorts of things in the home. So it was a stepping stone. And what we found is that a lot of these very rote tasks tend to be a stepping stone to higher level work pretty quickly. Once you expose people to the knowledge economy and the internet, they start figuring things out on their own and pretty quickly move beyond some of the very rote tasks to higher level tasks, and then they leave Sama and get better jobs. The one criticism that I've heard consistently that does resonate is the idea that technology is advancing at such a rate that pretty soon the people we're training to do some of these jobs, like image tagging and data entry, will be outpaced by computers doing the same jobs. And what do we do in that case? So I think that this is just part of being a good business person. You have to always be thinking about what happens when technology eclipses what you're doing, and I think everybody in every sector needs to be thinking that way. But for us, for our organization, our tagline is give work, and the kind of work we presently give to about 900 people around the world is this kind of lower end digital service work. So we have to think about what's going to happen once algorithms get smarter and pretty quickly adapt to that new world. And I think we also need to be thinking in the longer term what we're going to do when technology obviates the need for humans in many more categories than just the ones we're operating in, which is certainly going to happen. It's just a matter of when. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think it just means that NGOs like ours have to adapt to changing circumstances. Back there?
Just wait a second.
I think they need one for the camera.
Hi, that sounds fantastic, thanks. So I have two questions. The first one is, you've spoken about the tagging aspect. How do you curate other digital jobs that could potentially expand that the job pool that you do offer to your people? And the second one is on a more community engagement point of view. How do you understand in what from a demographic point of view where you should be focusing and which communities you should be working in that already have a certain level of knowledge and expertise that you can then just build on?
So I wish we had like a grandmaster plan, and we probably should, but we're pretty opportunistic as an organization. I had lots of plans in the early days that ended up just being really interesting archives on my computer because they didn't materialize. So we're pretty responsive to what comes in. We have a sales team, an enterprise sales team of 4 that all come from the private sector, and they go out and prospect for new opportunities. We had a strategy of getting a couple of big name enterprise clients, and now we're trying to go deeper within those clients and grow accounts with companies like Microsoft and Google, which are our 2 biggest customers. So we spend a lot of time talking to data science teams at these companies and understanding what their needs are and figuring out how we can equip our workforce with the skills to be competitive in this industry. It's interesting that being a socially impactful organization and being an NGO doesn't really matter when it comes to signing a purchase order. Companies might stay with us because we've got this great story and it's really moving, but they're certainly not going to choose us over anyone else on that basis. So we have to be competitive in the early stages and trials, which means that we're constantly trying to equip our workforce with new skills and trying to package those skills in appealing ways to customers. To your point about where we end up going, again, I wish it was much more strategic than it is, but it started because I met a guy who ran an internet cafe in Kenya. I was actually there on safari in 2006, and I have a problem, which is I'm always coming up with new ideas for new companies. So I was kind of bored on safari, and I told my friend I was going to go back to Nairobi, and his dad happens to be a professor at one of the best schools in Kenya and is really interested in entrepreneurship. So I went back and I was talking with this guy, Henry Thairu, about ideas that I had. And we were talking about the outsourcing industry. I had spent a little bit of time as a consultant there. And he said, well, you should meet some of the local entrepreneurs who run computer businesses. I'm sure that would be really inspiring. So he organized a meeting of like 40 local entrepreneurs who ran internet cafe type businesses. There was one woman who had a data entry company for local customers in Nairobi. And we started brainstorming different kinds of social enterprises. And the idea that really won out was this idea of creating an outsourcing model that would deliberately hire people from low-income communities in Nairobi. And I remember really clearly the guy who was my first partner. So he ran this little internet cafe with 4 computers in downtown Nairobi. And he told me that he couldn't make his business model work because he couldn't find enough people who were willing to spend like $1 an hour on computers. So he said, well, if you can find me a contract in Silicon Valley, I can find you young people from the slums nearby who certainly make less than a living wage locally and who are definitely skilled enough to do basic data entry, and I'll manage the work part of it if you can get the contracts and help me make sure that I'm filling a customer need. So that's how we got started, with just one computer center. And when Steve Muthay left us as a partner, because we'd sort of graduated him from our partner program, he had taken over the whole floor of an office building in downtown Nairobi with like 150 computers, and had hired tons of people from the local community to do that work. So we tend to get pulled in like that to different communities. We have an application process, and what we call delivery centers can apply to join our network. And we now have about 8 of those delivery centers around the world with whom we have relationships, and we're building our own now in Nairobi so that we can own part of our workforce and do testing and those sorts of things. And I think those kinds of pull models in international development are more effective than the push models, right? Where you come in and announce that you're offering some kind of a service regardless of how much demand there might be for that. We tend in the aid world to think really differently from the way that people think in the private sector, in that we don't always think of low-income people or beneficiaries as our customers. And I found that when you think of them that way, you tend to be much more responsive to actual demand rather than perceived demand. And the history of aid is littered with examples of the problems that can ensue when you have a push model instead of a pull model.
Is it okay?
Okay.
Yeah. So does this model work as you mentioned you're registered as a nonprofit. Does this model work as a business model, or is it something that will only work as a nonprofit model with donors subsidizing what your clients are giving you?
So that's a really interesting question, because a lot of businesses are not profitable, right, and are subsidized by just a different form of capital, which is venture capital. In fact, like a large number of companies don't become profitable and are subsidized by venture capital. We are at present, if you just look at the SamaSource business unit, we are probably 85% cost coverage through earned revenue, which is for a nonprofit a pretty good milestone. We'd like that to be over 100%, so we would like to be a profitable enterprise in the next 2 years, and it's definitely trending that way. And in the initial stages, as with any company, there are just certain costs that you need to cover right off the bat, and you can't, for various reasons, including growth, be profitable immediately. But I think it's a good benchmark for us. If I were registering SamaSource today, I would probably have set it up as a B corporation. The problem was that back in 2008, nobody really knew what B corporations were. There were like 3 impact investors. None of them were actually giving away much money. And so my options were to go down Sand Hill Road and pitch venture capitalists, which I did. And they all said, your business sounds awesome, but why are you trying to hire these poor people? And what's this whole, what's this point on your financial sheets about paying for training and like going to slums and recruiting people? That just doesn't make any sense. Why don't you just like open it up to whoever is skilled enough to apply? So if we had a model that just hired anyone from a low-income country, we could certainly make it work much more cheaply and more profitably, but I wasn't really interested in that. I mean, outsourcing is a pretty boring industry. It's not the kind of thing that kids dream about when they're little, right? So I dreamed about creating a poverty alleviation organization, and to me, the business model was just a means to that end, and there was no way I was going to give up the whole point of helping poor people escape poverty in order to get my initial capital from VCs. So I went the nonprofit route. I'll say that one of the biggest challenges with doing that is the restrictions on funding. In the US, the way that you raise money for a nonprofit is generally through large institutional grants, and those come with a lot of restrictions about how you use the money, which can often run counter to your own organization's strategic plan, and also counter to any kind of common sense. So, so that's been a challenge, and I would encourage people today to just think really broadly about the long-term impact that you want to create and design your business structure around that goal, rather than start with, I believe that I should do a for-profit or a nonprofit, because really all of that is just details, right? What really matters is creating the best business structure to further your goal.
Front here.
Hey there. Just a really quick question about the other end of the kind of dual-sided market. So the companies that are providing the work, What was it like approaching them, and what was their reaction when you kind of gave them the idea of, hey, this is what we're doing, and these are the jobs, and this is the impact you're going to have?
It was so hard. So I really, I'm kind of an introvert, and I can like survive in a cocktail party if I go and I talk to one or two people, but the idea of having to go and talk to everyone is really overwhelming and a little bit scary to me. And so the only way I was able to even network in the early days was by thinking in the back of my mind about the people that I just met in Nairobi and the fact that I really wanted to make this model work and bring them jobs. And so that led me to join a bunch of incubator type programs. And we ended up getting funded by the Stanford Social Enterprise Challenge, which is a social enterprise business plan competition, and some of the judges of that challenge helped make connections to early companies. And then we got picked up by the Facebook Fund, which was an incubator program for startups that were using the Facebook platform back in 2009. We were like one of 2 nonprofits that joined. And there was really no benefit. All the other companies got funding from Founders Fund, and we got no money. We just got like a desk at the Facebook offices and the chance to pitch a lot of angels in the Valley. And those early connections really helped. But it still took many years before anybody would take me seriously. I remember, so our first contract was with a social entrepreneur, Jim Fruchterman, who started Benetech. He's a regular at the Skoll World Forum, and he's a Skoll awardee, I think. So Jim was like the only business person that would sign a contract with me for the first 6 months. Everybody else was like, this seems crazy. Kenya doesn't even have fiber optic capacity. Like, I would show them pictures. I didn't really understand that I had to market on the basis of our competency and not our social impact. So I'd show them all these pictures of the Kenyan slums, and I was like, isn't it awesome? I'm hiring these people from the slums. And they were just like, no, like, how are these people going to have reliable internet access? And this just makes no sense. And so I scared people away. I did all of our own marketing materials in the early days on Pages with my Mac, which looked really bad. It was kind of a disaster. And I remember meeting someone from Google in 2009 who was like, this is such a powerful idea. Google should totally be a client of yours. And I was like, I agree. And it took me 2 years. And we have over 65 Google contacts in Salesforce that I met with, some of them many, many times, before we got our first tiny, tiny deal with Google. And now it's a multi-million-dollar, multi-year contract. But it took me a really long time to win that first contract. And I think one of the biggest challenges of running a social enterprise is in the early days, your only validation will come from, in my case, it was the people who got jobs. That was like, those were the only people who believed in the model. Everybody else, funders, donors, advisors, my former professors thought I was completely insane.
Hi, thanks for sharing with us. I wanted to ask, in terms of the people who you hire to perform microtasks or to go through your program, how do you quality control on that side, or how do you recruit for people who you know will enhance your value proposition to businesses, basically?
Yeah, great question. That was one of the reasons that we decided to partner with local on-the-ground companies, which was a bit of a tough decision to make, because on the one hand, we have all of these local partners, many of which are for-profit companies that do extract a profit margin from the work, right? So we're a nonprofit. We give the contracts to these for-profit companies, then they hire individual workers. I kind of had to do it that way at the beginning because I didn't know how I was going to procure computers and set them up in Kenya and negotiate with an ISP for reliable internet access. And there's all this like wheeling and dealing you have to do to set up an entity in Nairobi, and I just didn't have the money or the time to do that. And I had this guy who was running this internet cafe already, and I thought, well, why not use this latent capacity? So again, it was an opportunistic decision to structure that way. And one of the benefits of structuring that way is that nobody knows the local labor market better than people in country. One of the downsides of doing things that way is that you can end up with a situation, if you're not very careful, like the garment factories in Bangladesh, where the end worker is getting screwed and you don't know, even if you have the best intentions as the buyer. The nice thing about the digital economy is that you can communicate directly with the end workers. Yeah. And one of the things that I encourage a lot of social entrepreneurs to do is to instill impact tracking software or impact tracking methods at the very outset of your business model. Because impact really for us is the equivalent of profit in the for-profit space, right? It's the one thing that we're optimizing for. Everything else comes after that. So we have to know that people are actually making more money as a result of our intervention, or we're a failure. So that means that we started surveying workers immediately, and we actually required them to connect to us on Facebook so that we had a channel outside of the employer to reach the workers. And we also, some of them didn't have mobile phones, but typically they get mobile phones within the first month of working at Sama. So we also get their mobile phone number. And we've done a lot of our surveys through mobile phones and through Facebook. And Facebook works really well for longitudinal studies because people tend not to abandon their Facebook profiles the way they might a prepaid phone plan. So that's, I think, one of the benefits of technology with this model of impact sourcing is that you no longer have the excuse of not knowing what's happening on the ground, right? We've even thought about putting GoPros in some of our centers and having like a live feed so that we can literally see what's happening on the ground at the workplace, and not to be big brotherish towards our workers, but just to make sure that the facilities that they're working in are up to code, and that, you know, we feel confident that our mission is being reflected in the way that workers are treated on the ground.
Thanks.
I think they should do that at garment factories, frankly.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And then down here.
Thank you for your time. I was just wondering if you live in the U.S. and presumably you've benefited a lot from, you know, their education systems, healthcare, defense, etc. So do you feel it's maybe okay that since there are close to 50 million people in the U.S. beneath the poverty line, that maybe they are also more deserving, or is it purely based on income levels, and is that your criterion for picking, you know, which sets of people you target for employment?
Yeah. Again, I wish it were more strategic, because if it were just based on income levels, then I would go after the people living in extreme poverty, and there are hundreds of millions of people that live on less than $1 a day, adjusted for purchasing power parity. So I would be morally obliged to go after those people. However, as an entrepreneur focused on what's the greatest good I can do with the limited resources that I have, it's choosing people who are the low-hanging fruit. So people who are educated and still living at less than the local living wage line in places where there is the right environment for SamaSource to succeed. We've tried actually going to places that are not the right environment. I tried once setting up a branch of our program in Dadaab refugee camp, which is just made headlines because Kenya is trying to close it down, but it's the largest refugee camp in the world. I don't know if it's still that way after Syria, but it had 800,000 people at its peak, and it's a Somali refugee camp that's right on the border of Kenya and Somalia, and most people in the camp are living on less than $1 a day, and it's a horrible, destitute place. We had read that there were computer centers there, and we tried to go there, and we ended up spending so much more money per person trying to help people in Dadaab than helping thousands more people in Nairobi. And I hate thinking of things through the narrow lens of cost benefit, but sometimes when you have limited resources and a finite amount of time, you kind of have to proceed with a more utilitarian philosophy. So we did that in Nairobi. Why did we decide to move into the US? I had been thinking for a long time that moving to the US would have a couple of advantages. One is that we have a lot of people who are passionate about our model, but who don't want to go to Uganda or Kenya. A lot of donors who have pretty deep pockets who would be really happy to support us if they could see a local version of what we do. Secondly, we thought that there were pretty low-cost ways, pretty high leverage ways that we could take pieces of our model and make them work in the US without shifting focus away from our international work, because there was so much funding and so many people excited about doing something in the US. So we set up a separate division to do that, and I hired somebody to run it. And I said, you have a year, you have this much capital that a donor had committed to us, and you have to meet this threshold. People had to earn more money than it cost to train them after the program was over. And I said, if you can meet these criteria, then the board will likely bless you to continue running this program, and we'll treat it as a separate P&L. We'll take it out completely from SamaSource and just run it as a little R&D program. And initially, I wasn't sure, where that would go. I had pretty low expectations, and then the woman who I hired to run it she's amazing, and she blew everybody away. And she formed this program, which is now getting tons of enthusiasm from donors in the States, which are now contemplating for the first time funding our international work because they've seen what we can do locally. And there are a couple of really good examples of international organizations that have done something domestic like that. Partners in Health, Paul Farmer's nonprofit would be one of them. And I think there are lots of benefits to doing that, but it doesn't always follow the most rational, strategic plan. So again, I think it would fall in the category of an opportunistic decision. You can use the mic.
Hi, my name is Mohammed Amersi. I'm an EMBA student here in my second year. One of the points you made was whether you were different or indifferent, whether this was for-profit or non-profit. So one of the things that we have done here is to set up a vehicle that is also going to be doing or is doing already social impact investing in IT as well as in education. And the experience I found was that both the people that invested with us and also the clients that our investee companies have attracted are very much focused on us being for profit, albeit measured profit, because they think that by having a profit line, we will instill in people the financial discipline that comes with having to account. And secondly, that we have to focus on the triple bottom line, which is ensuring that every investment we make has a social impact which is measurable. So we subscribe to the GIIN standards for measuring impact, and also that we have to show environmental impact as well. So that's one point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make is that in a place like India, where we have partnered with an Indian outsourcing company called Rural Shores, and we are now sort of going international with them. Kenya is one of the places where we hope to start by the year end. So they are targeting the 2% that the Indian government has now made it mandatory on all large companies to dedicate 2% to CSR. Mm-hmm. Have you thought of exploring that sort of source for your funding?
Yeah, Rural Shores was actually one of our delivery centers early on, and we ended up parting ways with them for various reasons, but I really respect their leadership, and I think they have a great model, and I do hope that they join us in Kenya, because the more people that are doing impact sourcing, the more legitimate the space becomes. To your point about financial discipline, so I find that a little patronizing, to be honest, because nonprofit doesn't mean non-revenue, right? Like, Goodwill Industries is one of the largest nonprofit, I guess you could call it a conglomerate, because there are Goodwills all around the world. It's set up like a franchise organization, but Goodwill did over $3 billion in in-store sales last year. So that's like much better, and they make a lot more revenue than a lot of tech companies that I know that make very little revenue and are taking venture capital and might eventually intend to make a profit. But I think the idea that nonprofits are not disciplined financially or not tracking things is just a little silly to me. I do think that there's a powerful argument to be made for sustainability. That's a different argument from financial discipline, right? Sustainability says that you should try to generate as much income as you can through your business model, because it'll make you less dependent on the whims of donors. And I think that that's absolutely true, and we've seen over and over in the last 6 years that the more we have to rely on donors, the more we get moved away from our strategic plan and some of our goals. Did you have a follow-on question?
If I may.
Mm-hmm.
So the issue is not on the revenue, the issue is on expenses. And so the way people look at us, and I'm sure they look at you as well, is that how much of every dollar they give you is actually used to create value in impact, and how much of it is used in expenses, and that's where the profitability measure comes in.
So I also think that that's a really myopic view, and I think that there's a great TED Talk by Dan Pallotta on this subject. I think that the tyranny of measuring nonprofits in terms of overhead only made sense at a time when we couldn't track outcomes, right? Because we didn't have reliable technologies, or we didn't have reliable systems to actually track outcomes. But if you can track outcomes, if you can actually say, we can move this many people from point A to point B as a result of our intervention, which costs this much, then you have a return on investment, in which case whatever you're spending your money on internally is irrelevant, right? Because all I care about as a donor, all I should care about if I'm the right kind of donor, is dollars in to impact out, right? And then I should be able to have like a chart. Let's say I want to reduce poverty in Kenya. I should be able to have a chart that says, okay, organization A cost me $400 a person to move them from $1 a day to $3 a day. Organization B cost me $2,000 a person to move someone from $1 a day to $3 a day. Therefore, I'm going to put my money in the best available charitable option, which is A, right? This all is a lot more complicated in the social impact sector because we don't have the benefit of a unifying metric like profit, and we don't have the benefit of a unifying measure like dollars. But increasingly, as organizations in the nonprofit sector get more sophisticated, we've started agreeing as a sector on certain outcome measures. The poverty rate is one of them, so moving people from one point to another. In the health sector, we look at disability or quality adjusted life years. So you can actually measure, if you have a malaria bed net intervention, how many years of life does that add to the average person who receives the intervention? And you can then do all sorts of really interesting outcome analysis based on that. So I just think it's really lazy to suggest, and I know you're not suggesting that, but you could say this to some of the donors, but it's a little, organizations that are not tracking outcomes, I would say don't fund them. Every organization should be able to tell you what is the outcome, and not just how we're spending our money or how much is going into program versus overhead, but how many people are getting what kind of benefit. So there's no excuse not to do that. And if you can do that, then there's really no reason that donors should be worrying about how you're spending the money. As someone said to me once, it would be like walking into a bakery and handing over $1.50 for your muffin and saying, well, 75 cents on this $1.50 need to go into flour, and 10 cents need to go into eggs, and 5 cents need to go into sugar. And if you spend more than XYZ on salaries, then your muffin is all wrong. I mean, it's just a really silly way of looking at nonprofit efficacy. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for your great story. Right now I'm living in Pakistan and working in the development sector, so I see the reality that how your idea, the business model is really needed in the market and also the poor people in the community. So I'm really glad to know that your business. I have two questions. You mentioned that your business model right now have the 85% of the revenue, right? So I'd like to know that how many percent is coming from your client, like from the poor, or from the company side, like Google or the other company. So if I could know that the share of your revenue, the breakdown, that's really appreciated. And the second question is about the social impact indicator. You have mentioned a great story that around a certain percent of the poor people remain the same level of the income, or they increase their income, right? So I'd like to know that other than that, the income increase, what kind of social indicator you're following up to measure your, the impact to your business? Thank you.
Sure. So all of that earned revenue I mentioned comes from our technology, generally our technology, sometimes educational and data corporate clients. We don't yet have a revenue model that involves charging anyone on the ground who's a beneficiary, although we are thinking for our training program of charging a nominal fee. We see a lot of people in countries like Kenya and India take out huge loans to go through a private, business process outsourcing vocational training program, only to not get a job at the end of that and then to have to repay a loan shark at insane rates. In fact, there was a really good article about a Pakistani online degree mill that just came out in the New York Times that sort of epitomizes that problem. So we do think that charging something very nominal and possibly having a differential pricing model for our training program makes sense, and we'll likely introduce that at some point in the next year. And we expect that our training model will at some point become self-sufficient on the basis of those training fees, as well as governments, I think, have an ethical duty to provide workforce training, so we'll likely get government contracts to do that as well. And then the next question about how we track impact. So this is like the $1 million question in our space. We look at poverty first and foremost because I think it's the most reliable indicator of other things. And there's a lot of really interesting work that's being done on what happens when somebody increases their income to above a living wage and what they tend to spend their money on. We also do surveys, so we have quite a lot of qualitative data on how household expenditures shift. And we found that for the most part, that money goes into food and shelter, education, and healthcare at the household level. So we see a lot of workers doing this work to be able to afford some kind of tertiary institution afterwards. They might be saving up for college, or they might use it as leverage to get some kind of a loan, or very often they use it to pay the school fees of a younger child in the household. Mm-hmm.
5 minutes left, so one more quick question. Just in your, oh, yeah.
Unless someone else wants to ask. Perfect. I had a question more towards the, I guess the people, the Googles and all that. I agree that this is a great way to educate people. My first job out of college was a paralegal, so I was doing monkey work, but I learned a ton because I was in a big corporate environment. But I was wondering from the company side, what's their main motivation? Is it a donation to further education, or are they really benefiting from outsourcing this type of work?
Definitely not a donation. I mean, the procurement guys who are signing the contracts have to prove to their bosses that they chose the best vendor and got the best deal. So the corporations that hire SamaSource would typically be outsourcing this work to a different outsourcing company. We're often in competitive bids with for-profit companies that have very different models than ours, which begs the question, well, is this really providing any sort of additional benefit if there are for-profit companies that do the same thing and hire people to do it? And I would argue yes, because we're getting people who normally would be overlooked by outsourcing firms as workers. So people from slums, women from rural areas, people in very non-traditional locations who sort of need a boost to get into the job market. And once they've finished with SamaSource, they typically don't need an NGO anymore to hire them. There's no, there's no basis for a subsidy once they're able to get a job in the formal sector. So, we justify our model by saying that these are non-traditional workers that wouldn't ordinarily get these jobs, and we make them competitive against other companies in these bidding processes that corporations run. And I think there are a lot of other follow-on effects of doing that. I think just the fact that Google now works in Uganda and sends work to Kampala opens up other companies' eyes in terms of where there might be talented workers to employ, and might cause some other shifts that we don't expect in the way that people think about hiring. So hopefully that answers your question. We do find that the social mission has a really powerful marketing benefit. Honestly, we've gotten so much press coverage as a result of setting up these internet centers in really unlikely places, and that's driven a lot of business our way. So I think it does sort of emerge in that area, and also when it comes to reevaluating the vendors, companies annually usually look at their vendor list and see if they can cut costs in any way and see if they're working with the best vendors. And we have the advantage of being like the feel-good option. So provided we're offering a competitive service that's competitive on the basis of cost and quality, generally speaking, the people in procurement love working with Sama. Like, why would you not want to help end poverty while also getting your work done, right? So I think it makes it harder to switch from us.
Thank you very much, Leila. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.